Hi, and welcome to Alpine Animal Welfare in the Middle Ages. Together we'll go on a little trip through the Alps to explore the lives of humans and animals. And that ranged from things like grisly animal murder mysteries to more wholesome things like retirement homes for cows. So this was originally part of a panel at the IMC 2026 about protecting animals, and everything that follows is going to be about that topic. So firstly, I'll look at the knowledge and practices Alpine villages had regarding animal health, and the second part is dedicated to the question how people cared for the well-being of animals beyond merely preventing death or disease. And everything that you're going to hear about is based on a small selection of case studies from my dissertation, where I look at this area. Hang on, yeah, this area. So what you see here is the area of investigation of my dissertation. That's you have the outline of Switzerland to give you a rough guideline. So you have from left to right, from left to right, you have Valais, Uri, Grisons, Liechtenstein, and Tyrol. And the time span they look at is roughly the 14th to the 16th century. And the little dots that you can see, they represent the sources that I've used. They are mostly from village archives, and they contain a treasure trove of fascinating information about human-animal relationships. And it's also the reason why I mentioned it here, because you're interested in that topic. I mean, really go for it. I found great things, great stuff. I'm convinced that similar things are just waiting to be discovered in other regions, and even includes things like villages being surprisingly unbothered by wolves and bears. I won't intro that here, but well, I'm always up for a chat, so hit me up wherever you want to. And with that subtle hint out of the way, let's get started properly. So, in this area, the lives of humans and animals were very closely intertwined and had a couple of reasons. I'm going just to mention two. The first of which is that Alpine transportation was based less on waterways, I think for pretty obvious reasons, and it instead relied heavily on the work of pack and draught animals. But the most important factor was a strong focus on animal husbandry, especially in the form of the Alpwirtschaft. So the Alpwirtschaft was pretty much the defining feature of Alpine society, and it was developed to cope with a problem that mountains pose to agriculture. The higher you go, the slower plants grow. So in addition to that, the Alpine soil and topography also aren't great for growing crops. And that's the reason why there's a trend which exists until today to instead focus on livestock. It's also one of the reasons why Swiss became synonymous with cheese, basically. Grass also grows slower, and the Alpwirtschaft is designed to cope with that problem. So, as you can see in that beautiful diagram beneath me, animals are released in spring and they graze down in the valley. They are then driven upwards where the grass had a bit of time to grow, and this is then repeated again and again until the whole thing is done in reverse. And whenever lower lying pastures aren't being grazed, they are used to produce hay, which then feeds the animals through the long alpine winters. The first traces that we have of the Alpwirtschaft actually date back to the Neolithic era, still done today, so it's a very long-lasting practice which depends actually, on the careful maintenance, management of spaces and animals. People needed a lot of knowledge to be able to adjust to a whole host of different issues, plenty of potential problems, and it included pretty big and complex ones, like those in the first case study, the pigs of Andea. So, this case study shows not only how difficult it could be to protect animal health, but also how people could learn to deal with that through basically a process of trial and error. So, in 1564, the village of Andea defended itself in court against charges that they mismanaged an alpine pasture called Lambettchen, including the claim that they maliciously prevented others from driving pigs up there. And they stated, however, that no one, not even they themselves, were allowed to bring pigs up onto the Alp because it was an ancient custom. Basically, to summarize, other animals on an Alp, well, they might get sick, fall down a ravine. Alpine pastures apparently generally not great for animal health, but pigs were different. Pigs just died. Witnesses were then called, and one old man said that 30 years before, when the plague was in Andea, the village decided to put the old wisdom to the test. And he was the one charged with doing so. So he gathered up all the pigs of the village and went with the pigs up to the Alp. They arrived, the pigs were happy. He went to sleep, and when he woke up, the pigs were dead. So I thought it was a pretty fanciful story, but maybe a couple of pigs died, and it was 30 years ago, so like every year another pig gets added to the mental death toll. So I contacted a couple of veterinary experts, and together we were able to determine that in all likelihood the story of the old pig herder was entirely true. And not only that, it was something which was bound to happen every time people tried to put pigs on Alps in this region. And the reason for that was a combination of three factors. So firstly, you have a long trek to the Alps, and that exhausted the pigs, made them significantly more vulnerable to injury and sickness of all kinds. And secondly, after their arrival, the pigs would have eaten loads of old cotton. That's a kind of curds which are a waste product of cheese production. And this is what killed them. Because if pigs eat fermenting foods like curds, this can cause the hemorrhagic bowel syndrome, where the colon is explosively untwisted and death can occur within 20 minutes. The amount and the age of the old Alpine curds on the Alpwirtschaft made them a lot more dangerous. And just to repeat what the pig veterinary expert told me, the pigs basically explode internally, and as she put it, they tend to leave behind pretty grotesque corpses like big pink pig balloons. Now, the most important reason or factor is actually number 3, and that's people back then couldn't know that the curds were the issue, and not like that the Alp itself wasn't killing the pigs, because they actually regularly fed the pigs curds back home without any major issues. And the reason for that was only recently discovered, because if pigs grow up eating curds, they become immune to them. They develop a resistance to HBS. But that's only true for curds from the cauldron that they grew up with, because every cauldron has kind of its own microbiome, its own specific blend or mix of yeast and bacteria and so on and so forth. So that means an Alpine cheese cauldron, that's like a poisoned chalice for them. So if you think back to the 1530s, when the village of Valais, in a time of crisis, decided to put the old wisdom to the test, only to see it confirmed in a horrifying way. I mean, just imagine pig herder come back, where are the pigs? You go up to the Alp to look for yourself, and when you look out onto the Alp, you just see these grotesque, bloated corpses littered everywhere. That's a moment that's going to be seared into your memory, both as an individual and collectively, like as a community. And it's a moment where we can see today how practical knowledge, pigs don't belong on Alps, was developed, passed down, and reinforced. And actually, that was the only sensible option. The people arrived at the right conclusion. They couldn't prevent pigs dying up there. There's another issue in other regions, but, well, in Grison, don't put pigs on Alps, they'll explode. So, oh, sorry. That's a slight delay there. Anyway, another notable case which shows that people in the Alps had extensive knowledge about animal health is what I call the urban cows of Dicentis. So that's a case from the 16th century where a farmer demanded retribution from a wealthy mine and smelter owner because he claimed that that person was responsible for the death of his cows. What had happened, according to the farmer, is that one winter night when he was laying sick in bed, his cows had broken into a smelter and had eaten the iron that they had found there. The reason why the farmer knew this is that he noticed something peculiar when his cows got sick. They started to produce glittering cow pies. He called up a local official to behold his glittering manure pile. It was full of small shiny particles, and the farmer said, well, obviously that's iron glittering in the sunlight. A short while afterwards, his cow started dying. He called up another official to attend an obduction that he, the farmer, would conduct. And in their quote is what the official attested that he saw. So the cow's inside looked like they had been peeled in some parts, and others were strangely wood-like and brittle, with loads of what looked like shiny salts strewn everywhere. I contacted a cow veterinarian, in this case, who told me that the farmer had basically done exactly what he would have done, and also correctly deduced the most likely cause of events. So the iron had probably been in the form of granules, like a powdery substance, because it was in the midst of processing. And that would have been very tempting for cows in the midst of winter, because cows tend to suffer from a lack of minerals, even at the best of times, and they aren't picky when it comes to finding ways of alleviating that problem, meaning they eat and lick all kinds of weird things. Now, iron, especially in that region of Grison, is often found clumped together with quartz, and cows can easily digest quartz. They can easily swallow quartz, but they can't digest it. And quartz crystals have a lot of microscopic sharp edges. So the salt, hang on, the salt in that quote, that was actually quartz, and that is what had cut up the insides of the cows. And that strange bark-like substance, that was coagulated blood. It's a fascinating case with tons of other remarkable details, but I want to focus on just one, and that is how it ended. Because the judges listened to the farmer's story, and they were convinced by it. They were convinced by him. They decided against the wealthy and influential mine owner, and they agreed that he should pay damages to the farmer because the smelter hadn't been cow-proofed enough. Obviously, we all know how cows are, especially in winter, so it's a case of liable negligence. And that shows really just how widespread knowledge about animals, the behavior, and dangers to their health was back then. The knowledge about animal health was also applied more generally to prevent the spread of disease. A lot of villages and Alpine cooperatives had rules that infected animals, and their herds had to be quarantined and kept inside the farms of their owners. And these rules were quite strict. In Appenzell, for example, the legally set minimum were 13 weeks of quarantine. Quarantine meant not only a physical separation, but also that all animals suspected of being sick were forbidden from drinking from the same water sources as healthy animals. So at all times of the day, regardless of whether or not a healthy animal was actually around. And that's remarkable because this practice, if they actually employed it as they said they should, counteracted different kinds of infection vectors quite effectively, and it applies or shows a kind of practical knowledge about disease transmission across water, which went beyond the base assumptions of humorism or miasmatic theory as they were common back then in human medicine. And the degree to which disease prevention was regarded as a common good can be seen in a dispute about the Alps, Kisal and Madretsch in 1470, because there a couple of villages had been quarreling for ages about who could use them, who could own them, and all of that was settled when a compromise was reached. That compromise was that from then on, these Alps should serve as a communal quarantine pasture for all villages, because ensuring that infected animals were then driven up to the Alps so they could recover in peace and without endangering any others by infecting them potentially, well, that was judged to be in the interest of all parties and would serve the greater good. And now I'd like to come to the second part. It's just some examples, not all of them, but I have to restrain myself because I really like talking about it. Just some examples that show just how willing Alpine villages and villagers could be to respect the well-being and needs of animals. So, firstly, there were various rules which were aimed at protecting animals from harm. And in the county of Tyrol, that explicitly included even animals that had caused harm themselves. For example, the Dorfbuch of Riffian warned that no one should take revenge for damage suffered by livestock by throwing something at them or beating them. And similar rules can be found in other villages, and it's really interesting the words that were used, because it stated that behavior like that would be Misshandeln or Misshandlung, and that's a term meaning mistreatment or abuse. So that's a very clear judgment. You weren't supposed to do that. That's wrong. You aren't allowed to do so. Quite a lot of villages also had strict fence regulations to ensure that they were built in a way that they didn't pose an injury risk to animals. So watch out and try to build them so that no pointy ends are just oriented towards the direction where an animal might bump into it or something like that. And one village even extended that to pointy tools. So you weren't allowed to lean your pointy tools, whatever they were, against your fence in a way that they might lean out into the street and poke a passing cow. Villagers were also willing to make exceptions to otherwise strict rules if it benefited animals. And the first area where we can see that is regarding pastures. So pastures were valuable and closely guarded resources. So this huge map that you can see was painted. Hang on, this huge map, I mean, look below, it's almost a meter across. It's really big. So this huge map that you can see was painted because of a conflict that had dragged on for years, and it was started specifically by this ox grazing where it wasn't supposed to. So you can see pastures serious business. But even otherwise hard rules barring outsiders from using common pastures didn't apply if those outsiders had work animals that needed to rest. And these exemptions could be quite generous, up to a week if an animal needed to recover from an injury, like a limping horse, for example. Another area where otherwise hard rules could be bent or broken for the benefit of animals was transportation. So the transalpine transport of goods relied on the road system where members of transport organizations were assigned work orders on a rotating basis. That's also the root of the name, road rotating. And according to the rules of the Road Organization of Imst in Tyrol in 1485, there were only two reasons why a member could be excused from their work duties. So either the member was away on a very long trip, stated in the source, if they're outside of the country, so really far off, or the second option is if the transport animals needed a break. If a horse had just given birth, for example, they were granted a kind of maternity break of at least 3 weeks. Transport across the Alps was also generally a lot slower in summer. There were a couple of reasons for that. I want to hone in here on just one, and that is that in summer transporters first had to fetch horses or oxen from the Alp. And when I encountered that phenomenon, and it shows up again and again, I just ask myself, well, why are the horses and oxen up there in the first place? Because they weren't needed for work there. After all, you don't use plows on an Alp, and well, horses and oxen aren't very useful for milk production. The reason for that is, as it turns out, winter, that's the main transport season. Carrying goods across the mountains, that was very taxing work. And transporters kept their horses and oxen on Alps in summer to ensure that the animals could really rest and recuperate from that long winter work period, to really ensure that they recovered from that. And this was a common practice even along the route to and from the Brenner Pass. That was the most important land-based trading route between Germany and Italy. It's still extremely important for, well, topographical reasons, basically. It's a very low line. And these trade patterns were, because of that, influenced, at least in part, by the fact that transporters insisted on granting their animals an extended wellness holiday on the Alp, an extended break from work. I just find that fascinating. Now, the last area that I'm going to be talking about, which also had ironclad rules, was the Alp itself. So a rule, like the road or the road duty, was the Alpzwang. That means Alp duty or obligation. So when the time came to drive animals up to the Alps, as many as possible had to be driven up to ensure that enough hay could be gathered down in the valley for winter feed. Never getting the hang of that. Anyway, only a very limited number of animals were exempt from the Alpzwang, like those needed for work, and very young ones, like calves, for example. But there were a couple of communities which also allowed cows that couldn't follow the herd anymore because they were injured, lame. In one case, it stated if they were too shy, whatever that means, or, most remarkably, too old. These cows were allowed to join the calves in pastures and forests down in the valley in what I call a kind of combined cattle kindergarten and retirement home. And this is particularly clear evidence that the relationship between humans and animals in the Alps in the Middle Ages wasn't based purely on economic logic, but it was based on emotions, emotional ties. Because a cow that was so old that it was left behind by the herd, that was no longer a productive cow. It wouldn't produce enough milk to turn a profit if it can't go up to the Alp. You can't use it anymore for work, which was common use of cows. So all that taken together means that not only their owners, but not only the willingness of the owners, but also of their communities to grant these old cows special privileges to remain down in the valley instead of, for example, butchering them. That's really a striking demonstration of how people appreciated animals. This is also a common theme in descriptions of animals like cattle, goats, sheep, and so on and so forth in sources like the Tierbuch. That's an excerpt from that. Tierbuch means book of animals, literally translated. You can see in this quote cattle as the most praiseworthy of all animals that had been created for the benefit of for humankind. That's written in part, at least, by Konrad Gessner, one of the great leading authorities in his day on all things natural history. And he and also Petrus de Crescentis, an early author, also had nice things to say about other animals, like donkeys, for example, and how one should appreciate them. But cattle were really especially near and dear to a lot of people, which also shines through in depictions of these animals, like this painting that you can see that the abbot of the monastery of Wettingen ordered as a companion piece to a poem celebrating a particularly beautiful ox, so that he may long be remembered even after he was butchered. So, to summarize, Alpine villages depended on animals, and they tried, even in the face of considerable challenges, to protect them. Practical knowledge about animal features played an important role, and it enabled people to find effective ways to safeguard animal health, which in some cases was even reminiscent of modern approaches like disease prevention by regulating water, for example. People put also in a lot of effort to keep animals properly, and proper animal husbandry that meant being able to adapt to a complex web of factors like pasture conditions, terrain, animal characteristics, the interests of all kinds of involved groups, and those groups that included even the animals themselves. Because outdoor life in the Alps in the Middle Ages wasn't easy, but with cows breaking into smelters and eating iron and just pigs exploding on Alps, people were still willing and able to care for animals, even beyond what would have been mere economic necessity. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. There's quite a lot more to talk about, but well.